So, um, so I had to think about what I wanted to talk about today, and I did. And what I want to talk about is this book. It's called The Greatest Prayer: Rediscovering the Revolutionary Message of the Lord's Prayer by John Dominic Crossan. And what kind of brought me to want to talk about it was the prologue in the book. And I'm going to almost verbatim read you the prologue. It begins with him saying, the strangest prayer. The Lord's Prayer is Christianity's greatest prayer. It's also Christianity's strangest prayer. It's prayed by all Christians, but it never mentions Christ. It's prayed in all churches, but it never mentions church. It's prayed on all Sundays, but it never mentions Sunday. It's called the Lord's Prayer, but never mentions the Lord. It's prayed by fundamentalist Christians, but it never mentions the inspired inerrancy of the Bible, the virgin birth, the miracles, the atoning death, or the bodily resurrection of Christ. It's prayed by evangelical Christians, but it never mentions the gospel. It's prayed by Pentecostal Christians, but never mentions ecstasy or the Holy Spirit. It's prayed by Congregational, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, and Roman Catholic Christians, but it never mentions congregation, priest, bishop, or pope. It's prayed by Christians who split from one another over this or that doctrine, but it never mentions a single one of those doctrines. It's prayed by Christians who focus on Christ's substitutionary sacrificial atonement for human sin, but it never mentions Christ, substitution, sacrifice, atonement, or sin. It's prayed by Christians who focus on the next life in heaven or in hell, but it never mentions the next life, heaven or hell. It's prayed by Christians who emphasize what it never mentions, and also prayed by Christians who ignore what it does mention. You could respond, of course, that there is nothing strange at all. It is, you might say, a Jewish prayer from the Jewish Jesus. Here, nothing Christian or even Jewish Christian is present. But that only invites us to start the question of strangeness all over again. It does not mention covenant or law, temple or Torah, circumcision or purity, and so on. What if the Lord's Prayer is neither a Jewish prayer for Jews, nor yet a Christian prayer for Christians? What if it is, as this book suggests, a prayer from the heart of Judaism on the lips of Christianity for the conscience of the world? What if it is, as this book suggests, a radical manifesto and a hymn of hope for all humanity in language that is addressed to all the earth? For the author of the book, the Lord's Prayer is both a revolutionary manifesto and a hymn of hope. It's revolutionary because it presumes and proclaims the radical vision of justice that is the core of Israel's biblical tradition. It's a hymn because it presumes and produces poetic techniques that are the core of Israel's biblical poetry. Throughout the book, the author talks about, and I'm not going to go into as much detail or even provide as much example of how he provides biblical examples of literary form, of content, biblical content, that all address each of the chapters that he addresses in the book. And I'll go chapter by chapter. Just once I hit each chapter, I'm just going to give a very, very brief summation of what he talks about, or the core of what he talks about, without providing all of the examples. Because if you choose to read it, the examples, many, many examples are provided in the book. The author discusses the concept of justice and how, in ordinary language, we think of justice in terms of retribution. But the primary meaning of justice is not retributive, but rather distributive. Kind of like St. Benedict. All to meet their needs. The distributive justice. You get what you need. Rather than thinking of justice as retribution, think of justice as distribution. And that was another thing about the book that made me want to read it, because to me it was very much in line with St. Benedict's ideas of justice as well. So, distributive. To be just means to distribute everything fairly. The primary meaning of justice is equitable distribution of whatever you have in mind. And that includes retribution and punishment. So equitable distribution of anything and everything. The author states, just as the content of the Lord's Prayer is deeply embedded in biblical tradition of justice, so is its format deeply embedded in biblical tradition of poetry. He notes that just as biblical poetry, whether it's in prophecy, Psalms, or Proverbs, it works especially with one major technique. The device or technique that's used in all of those books and in the greatest prayer, the Lord's Prayer, is parallelism, in which the second part or two-part sequences says more or less the same thing as the preceding one. This creates a vibration of thought, a metronome in your mind, if you will. He states that poetic parallelism is a lure for meditation. He also talks about other forms of parallelism used throughout the Bible, including antithetical parallelism and also stepped, climactic, or crescendo parallelism, and provides examples of each. Throughout the book, in each chapter, he gives examples of the poetry, the message, and his thoughts on what those things mean. So that Just that was taken from the prologue. Right. Again, I'm not going to go in as much detail about his examples in the other chapters, but the other chapters, I'm going to kind of review what they are first. Chapter 1 is entitled, Pray Then in This Way. So it's taken from Matthew's Gospel when Christ is about to teach them the Lord's Prayer, the greatest prayer. The second chapter is simply Our Father in Heaven. The third chapter, Hallowed be your name. The fourth chapter, Your kingdom come. The fifth chapter, Your will be done on earth. The sixth chapter is Give us our daily bread. The seventh chapter, Forgive us our debts. The eighth chapter, Lead us not into temptation. And then there's a prologue following each of the chapters. So I'm going to begin with a much shorter overview than of each of the chapters. Chapter 1. Pray then in this way. Crossan provides an analogy of God as electricity in the airport. When you're in the airport and your cell phone's diminishing, and you know you got to keep your cell phone charged, okay? It's always there. There are outlets strategically placed throughout. Some of those are even, in the seats, right, as you're in the waiting area for your flight. It's always there, whether it's discovered or not. God is always there, whether he is discovered or not. Even when found, human freedom allows one to connect or not. Never forces itself upon us. Equally available to all. You don't have to merit it by your action or deserve it by your character. You can be rich or poor, young or old, gay or straight, female or male, or anything else you can imagine. The author sees God as electricity and prayer as empowerment by participation in and collaboration with God. And the idea of the collaboration with God, again, makes me think of Benedict. And I'm kind of jumping to our next book, our next topic, Lectio Divina. We put ourselves in the presence of God. He then looks at the biblical book of Psalms and discusses the two major categories of Psalms. Psalms of request and Psalms of gratitude, and how neither of these seems to emphasize participation or empowerment. The rhythm of prayer in the book of Psalms is that double chant of request followed by gratitude, petition by thanksgiving, and complaint by praise. Based on those biblical Psalms, our Christian prayer is full of requests of God through complaint and petition. It is also full of gratitude to God through praise and thanksgiving. But he asks, does Christian prayer also involve empowerment by God through participation and collaboration? To begin to address this, the author then moves from the Psalms to the biblical prophets moving, as he says, from those who talk to God to those who talk for God in prophecy. What do the prophets say about prayer and sacrifice? Well, the prophets insist that God does not want prayer, ritual, liturgy, or sacrifice, but wants instead righteous justice. That righteous justice rule not only the land of Israel, but all the earth. He provides multiple examples of this, and he discusses why the prophetic insistence exists. In this chapter, he also talks about St. Paul and his perspective on prayer. The author talks about how prayer matures over time. He talks about request, gratitude, and empowerment, and that's essentially how prayer grows and matures. Requests are our complaints and our petitions. Gratitude, our thanksgiving and our praise. And empowerment is our participation and collaboration in prayer with God. So that's chapter 1. Isn't it a kind of...
Wow, very
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 2, Our Father in Heaven. Well, in this chapter, the author struggles with how the greatest prayer opens with a male-oriented title and a patriarchal mode of address. Why give God a human-like and male-only name? Why not Spirit, Creator, or even God? Another book I recently read, I don't know if any of you have read it. If you have, it's called The Shack.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
2 or 3 times.
Yeah, isn't it? I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, when I read this, I thought about that. Because what happens is we kind of put God in a box. We have our idea of who God is. And part of the reason we're now getting into other language, non-gender language for God, is because when we make God a certain gender, we limit God, or we see God from that perspective. And even our Father, not everybody has a good image of Father. So he begins by saying, why male-oriented? Why Father? Why not just neutral? God, Spirit, Creator. And why not mother or parent? He examines 3 points. First, the role and power of the metaphor in general, but especially in religion and theology. So he looks at some historic perspectives. I'm not going into detail. I'm trying to keep it so it intrigues you. Yeah. Second, what other human-like and male-oriented names were not used? So, our Father. And if you're going to go with male-oriented, why not Warrior King, Just Judge, or even Feudal Lord instead of our Father? Finally, what was the meaning and content of Father then? And how should we interpret it today? Crossan says that the best way to think of what the biblical writers meant by our Father in heaven is as householder of the earth. He who takes care of the earth and everything on it. Chapter 3. Hallowed be thy name. This chapter begins with the story of Moses and the burning bush, and how God identifies, and I have in quotes, himself to Moses. How I probably should say, how God identifies to Moses, so that I don't say himself. Okay. It discusses how any name we have or use for God is inadequate and limiting. And I think we can agree on that. He states we cannot ever fully, adequately, or completely name the Holy One, stating that God is fundamentally unnameable. And yet we try, because we're human. Crossan discusses and provides multiple biblical references to God as hallowed and holy. And he urges that God is holy because he seeks justice for all, and that God is our model for holiness. Chapter 4, Your Kingdom Come. Well, this was really an interesting chapter for me too, because some of the things I was like, yeah, I see that, and some of them I was like, I hadn't thought of that, and this was one of those, I hadn't thought of it that way. Chapter 4, he presents an alternative to the violent normalcy of our world and a different vision of peace on earth. Crossan discusses historical biblical times. He introduces multiple terms and concepts which are discussed and explained. Some examples include Son of Man, the Holy Ones of the Most High, the Kingdom of God, Empire and Eschaton, the final event in the divine plan, which Crossan says is not about the destruction of the world, but rather is about its transformation into a place of justice and nonviolence. So thy kingdom come, to Crossan, is that peace and justice on earth will occur. He goes on to provide multiple biblical gospel stories to support his belief in God's kingdom, referring to the earth. Chapter 5, Your Will Be Done. In this chapter, Crossan argues that what is wrong with the world, sin, if you will, is the natural consequence of injustice rather than the violation that needs to be atoned for in order to escape divine punishment. In this chapter, he discusses the passion and death of Jesus on the cross as an act of collaboration with mankind rather than an act of substitution. He didn't die because Adam sinned. He examines when, why, how, and where the theological substitution arose. So that's a chapter that should, like, oh, I want to read about that. Chapter 6, give us our daily bread. In this chapter, the author argues that daily bread calls up all the bread and fish stories that are scattered throughout the Gospels. The feeding of the 5,000, Jesus directing the fishermen to where to fish, the Last Supper, all emphasizing God's plan is for a just distribution of food so that no one has to worry about hunger today and including all tomorrows. Forgive us our debts, chapter 7. The biblical notion of debt is tied closely to slavery and the hope of redemption and freedom. Crossan argues that Jesus' call for the forgiveness of debts should be taken literally. All the Bible stories about forgive your brother, or the prodigal son, where the father forgives his son, all of those stories, Crossan says, really should be taken literally. You should forgive all your debtors. God's justice, as embodied in his redemption of Israel's enslavement in Egypt, calls for the forgiveness of our debts and our pledge to forgive the debts of others. And chapter 8, lead us not into temptation. Most people think of temptation as an immoral inclination to do an evil act. But Crossan argues that temptation has a precise meaning in this context of using violence even if your goal is good and noble. So, and then in the post-log, I really didn't make any notes on that. In the post-log, he then talks about, because his whole point is love, peace, forgiveness on earth. And that he is the example to us of how to do that. So love, peace, equity, and then he talks about the idea of how there are some people that say, the Old Testament was the old law, the New Testament, the new law. The Old Testament talked about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In the New Testament, it talks simply about love. He then goes on to say the New Testament isn't all roses and honey. That there are things in there too, and he asks us to look at those things too when he talks about it in the post law. So the book really is worth the reading, and in particular because of the examples that I didn't provide you that he does. I just gave you kind of the main concept of each of the chapters. And does anybody have any questions or any comments?
When you mentioned about the Psalms,
Yes.
Our prayer are the Psalms.
Right. But again, what he's saying is, in terms of the prayer that Jesus taught us, he's saying that those are prayers, those are, if you will, less mature prayers.
Yeah.
As we move along our developmental phases.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And
okay.
and we all, and he says, and none is worse than the other,
Yeah.
but that for completion, you need to be able to pray all of them.
You have to integrate them.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. And I also really enjoyed the examples he gave of how the rhythm, the literary styles in the scripture.
Yeah.
So it's really a book that is worth reading.
The author and the name again?
The author is John Dominic Crossan, Crossan. And he's a professor emeritus at DePaul University. And he is widely regarded as the foremost historical Jesus scholar of his time. He's also the author of several other best-selling books, including The Historical Jesus and Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography. That's another title of one of his books.
And the title of this one?
The title of this one is The Greatest Prayer,
Thank you.
Rediscovering the Revolutionary Message of the Lord's Prayer.